Welcome to the John Ward House. We're in Salem, Massachusetts. This is a Peabody Essex Museum historic property, and we're talking about the very interesting history of this very old house. Built originally in 1685 and expanded a number of times. This house has always evolved to fit the need of whoever was occupying it at any given time. And so its exterior, as you see today, might look pretty even and congruent, is masking a very complex and very interesting history. So I'd like to point a few of those things out. I'm Stephen Mallory. I'm an architectural conservator, ground root preservation group from Cape Nettic, Maine. And we did a historic structures report on this house about a year ago and did a level 1 analysis examining physical evidence of surviving features. And we determined that there's a tremendous amount of data left to indicate what this house was originally and how it changed over time. This was kind of an unexpected find, as many have thought that a lot of this house's history was lost in a 1910 restoration that we'll be talking about. The house didn't originally stand here. It originally stood about a block away on St. Peter Street, and in 1910, in order to save it and preserve it, it was relocated here by the Essex Institute, and George Francis Dow restored it to a 17th century-like appearance. The problem there is that in 1910, collective understanding about what 17th century houses were really like was in its infancy and not very well understood. And so this house, while it sort of represents the aesthetic of the 1600s, it does not represent how this house ever looked at any one time in its history before 1910. To kind of talk about a few different things, you're looking at a 5-bay, 2-story house with facade gables. It actually started in 1685 from about the door over to this side of the house. This was the first side of the house. And we did dendrochronology on the timbers, which is a scientific process of tree ring dating, and we did determine that this side of the house was built in 1685. The timbers were felled in the fall or winter of 1684, and that could be determined because the cambium, or the growth layer of the tree for the year 1684, had reached maturity. So we know the timbers were felled in the fall, which means the frame was likely going up in 1685 when the next building season started. This side of the house did not originally have clapboards. It was only sheathed in wide sawn planks with beveled edges to promote drainage downward. It was a fairly plain exterior, and there's plenty of evidence to indicate that originally the eaves overextended the end walls by about 6 inches or so. Now, in 1692, this side of the house is constructed, and that was again established by tree ring dating. The timbers were felled in the fall season or early winter season of 1691, and the frame of the house was likely going up as soon as the weather permitted in 1692. Now, local Salem State history professor and archaeologist and 17th century expert Tad Baker pointed out to us an interesting thing, which is that at the time that the carpenters were framing up the roof and finishing this end of the house on its original site, they would have been in full view, had a clear view of Gallows Hill during the events of 1692 that unfolded that summer, which is kind of an interesting historical window into the experiences that this house has undergone. Now, the house around about 1770 was then thoroughly renovated inside and out. The facade gables were removed, and modern, for the time, 12/8 window sashes were installed, and the house became a Georgian house. And then in the early 1800s, it was renovated again, and it became a federal period house in some areas on the inside. As the 19th century wore on, hard times hit this house. By the mid to late 1800s, it had become a tenement, and it was condemned by the city of Salem in the 1890s but still continued to be lived in, though it was deemed unfit for habitation. It was a rooming house at that time, with Salem's kind of poorest and most transient people living in it. They were sailors, poor elderly widows, families, many, many people living in this house, basically from the attic down. And so I'd like to invite you inside to take a look at the physical evidence that sort of unfolds what this house has been at various times throughout its history.